In this presentation, in this third part, we're going to be talking about languages across the world. How many languages are there? It's hard to say. Between 6,000 and 7,000. Why is it hard to say? Well, a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's not clear what's a language and what's a dialect. So a point we'll be coming back to at the end of this presentation. The second reason is that languages die away, and that's another thing that we'll be talking about in this presentation. Here's an interesting statistic. 96% of the languages are spoken by a mere 4% of the world's population. That is to say that there are a number of languages out there that are spoken by very small groups of people. In contrast, what you can say is that 4% of the languages, in other words, a very small number of languages, are spoken by 96% of the world's population. So you have some languages out there that are spoken by lots of people. Here's the distribution of languages statistically, and you see that Europe, which represents the languages that most Americans learn, is a mere 3% of the world population, of the languages of the world. Here's something else that's interesting: the number of languages spoken in various parts of the world. Papua New Guinea, which is an independent country, half of the island of New Guinea, the other half is part of Indonesia, has over 800 languages. Indonesia has a very large number of languages. A couple of African countries, Nigeria and Cameroon, have a number of languages. You have indigenous languages, variety of those spoken in Mexico, Australia, Brazil. India has a variety of languages, and some very different from one another. We're going to look more specifically at Papua New Guinea because it's such an interesting case. There's so many different languages there, a variety of languages as well. So let's watch this clip, then we'll talk about it.
For the claim to be right, that the human species has a common human language, wouldn't we have to find it being used even in far-off places? Like Papua New Guinea. Here on this island, many tribes with many cultures have lived apart from the rest of the world for eons. Are their languages anything like ours?
This region, Melanesia, contains 0.1% of the world's population and about 20% of the world's languages. There's nothing like this country in the world linguistically. This country has 750 different languages spoken by 3 million people. Some of them are as different as English from French, some of them as different as French from Chinese.
The Menya people have never written their language. They've never invented the wheel. But they speak a language that has as complicated a grammar and discourse structure as any other language in the world.
Carl Whitehead of Manchester, England, has lived here with his family for 10 years. To complete his study of the Menya language, he thinks, may take him another 10 years.
The single most remarkable feature of the Menya language is the verb system. Most of its verbs can have anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 different forms. That compares to English, where a verb can have up to 5 forms. It has a very complex modal system. That is, whereas English talks of I may go, I can go, I should go, I will go, Menya collapses all that into a single word and has about 14 different ways of referring to an event that hasn't happened yet, but that could or that will or should happen sometime in the future. That's the genius of Menya.
When we start looking cross-linguistically, we find great universals. We don't find dozens or hundreds of different ways of building a human language. We find a very small set of possibilities. One possibility has to do with the position of the verb. You can put the verb at the beginning, the middle, or the end.
The menu verb ariri can have many different meanings depending on its context. It doesn't occur by itself, so by itself it is meaningless. It's the noun in combination with the verb ariri that has a specific meaning. So for example, a chingariri means she is washing. Hungariri, he is crying. Waariri, he's rubbing mud on his face. Tagnariri, he's building a fence. Piariri, it is raining. And there's a couple of poetic ones that I really like. The first one is referring to an aura around the moon, Kangwa Tagnariri, which literally means the moon is building a fence. Kangwa Tagnariri. And the other one refers to a special kind of sunset when the whole ground just lights up with a bright orange glow. And the expression is which literally means the sun is painting the ground red.
The reasonable first guess from all observers is that languages are utterly different from each other.
There are 5,000, maybe more than 5,000 languages spoken in the world. And if you're studying a foreign language, what you notice is how different that language is from the one that you speak. Of course, what you notice are the differences. But in fact, what Chomsky noticed is that these 5,000 languages of the world are really very, very similar.
Que juegue ahora, que juegue. Que juegue, coño.
You could even consider the 5,000 so-called languages that are spoken on this planet to be all dialects of one language, human language.
Why are so many languages spoken in this small country? Well, they're geographically, it's kind of a wild area, and there are groups that are separated physically from one another that for long stretches of time have lived independently. It's a very simple way of life. They're based on subsistence agriculture. But in terms of languages, very interesting languages and very variety of languages in Papua New Guinea. You see that this one linguist, and he's not alone, has spent many, many years trying to figure out just one language. It's so complex, and verb system has thousands of different possible forms. Excuse me, very, very incredibly complex in comparison to English. The importance of storytelling is something that is common across indigenous languages because this is how they have maintained their traditions, their stories, their culture, because typically they don't have a written form of the language. These are the most commonly spoken native languages, those first languages in the world. You see that Mandarin Chinese is far and away the most widely spoken language. And in fact, if you look at Chinese, you have down at number 10, Wu Chinese might be familiar to you. Wu is a group of Chinese languages that's spoken in South China. The largest is Shanghainese, but there are a number of Chinese languages that aren't even on the list here. Cantonese, for example, belongs to a family of languages in the far south, has over 50 million speakers. So you have a large number of speakers of Chinese languages. Then we have English as number 2, Spanish number 3. Bengali might not be familiar to, but Bengali and Hindi. Bengali is spoken in Bangladesh and parts of India. You have Javanese, number 11, might not be familiar. It's spoken in Indonesia. Languages, how are they classified? Well, two different ways, basically. One through the structure, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, basically either based on word order or based on endings. And the second kind of classification is by language family, and this is based on similarities and how languages are derived from one another. We'll be looking at that as well. So we'll start with this classification that separates languages according to structure. We'll watch a short clip.
There are two major ground plans, two great options in building a language. Relying on the order of words to convey the meaning of your overall thought.
English.
Or changing the endings of the words one by one and then shuffling them around.
Latin.
For example, instead of counting on order as we do in English, we might do it by saying, Mary A. hit John'em, by which we mean that Mary is clearly the actor, the A word, and John is clearly the one acted upon, the word.
This is simply book in English. Well, in Russian it's kniga if I hold it up and show it to you. But if I say I'm holding it up or I'm reading it, then it becomes knigu rather than kniga. We change the ending because when we're acting on an object, we have to say it differently. These endings are what grammarians call inflections.
You might wonder how many languages use the order ground plan, how many languages use the inflectional ground plan. And it's very, very hard to answer a question like that because every language uses a little of both. In English, for example, we use word order very much, but we still have inflections like the plural S at the end of words is an inflection that signifies the number. Over a period of time in the history of a language, it may change from being a highly inflected language to being a language without inflections, and then change back again.
We see this happening in English now. If you think of the ending v on could've, should've, would've, that v isn't a word anymore. It's not have, it's just v. It's becoming a grammatical ending.
So you have that basic distinction between languages that use word order primarily and languages that primarily use endings or inflections. The second way that we classify languages is according to language families. And there are a number of those language families out there. We'll be talking about a couple of the different language families. The largest is Indo-European. This has major groups of Germanic, Romance, Balto-Slavic, Celtic, Indo-Iranian, and there are others as well. This is the chart of language families. So you see familiar languages like English, which is a Germanic language. You see Spanish there as well, which is a Romance language, one of the sub-language groups. You also see that there are a number of Indian languages that are Indo-European as well. Germanic languages, families, subfamilies of interest probably to native English speakers, because that's that English belongs to. German obviously is a Germanic language as well as our Scandinavian languages. Icelandic is an interesting case because it's changed very little. So modern Icelanders can read with little effort the old Icelandic sagas, whereas if you, as a modern speaker of English, pick up something like Beowulf, be largely incomprehensible. Finnish is an interesting case. Finnish is not a Scandinavian language, not Germanic. It's not even Indo-European. It's a member of a language family that includes Hungarian and Estonian. It's a very difficult language to learn. There are 14 cases, only 4 in German, so German seems easy in comparison to that. Celtic languages, another interesting group within the Indo-European family. You have a number of languages there that may or may not be familiar, Scottish and Irish. And you have a number of these that are threatened. Cornish in the Cornwall area of England, Manx on the Isle of Man, Breton, which is actually spoken in Brittany in France. These are languages that are very difficult to learn if you're a native English speaker. I know that my brother learned Welsh, had a terrible time with pronunciation and with grammar, both. It's very different from English, and they're if you look at the written language, it looks like it's all consonants, very, very difficult to pronounce. Other subfamilies of Indo-European, Romance, languages, a lot of languages that are studied in the United States, some that aren't, Slavic languages, Baltic languages. You also have these subfamilies, Greek, Armenian, Iranian. Just trying to give you an overview of the great variety of languages there under Indo-European. In India, there are an amazing variety of languages. Not all are Indo-European. There are a number of other languages that belong to different language families. You also have in Europe languages that are not Indo-European. Basque is an interesting example, very old language spoken by the Basque people who live on in between France and Spain and the area of the Pyrenees Mountains. Hungarian is related to Finnish, also not Indo-European, Georgian, Turkish, Arabic, Hebrew. Here's some other language families. We talk about Indo-European being the largest, but there are a number of other language families out there. Mandarin is part of the Sino-Tibetan language family. Semitic is interesting because both Arabic and Hebrew belong to the Semitic family of languages. Politically tend to be very far apart, but linguistically they're very close. There's some other language families. We've talked a little bit about Siberian Yupik, which is part of the Eskimo Aleutian family, indigenous languages there. We're going to talk about a specific Australian Aboriginal language, Warlpiri, that is spoken by a small group of people in central Australia, but very interesting language. So let's watch a clip and then we'll talk about it.
If there are universal features to human language, wouldn't that apply to all people everywhere, even ancient people like the Warlpiri? Their language has been closely studied. What ground plan do they follow?
I'm studying the language of the Warlpiri people of Central Australia. The Warlpiri people are the Aboriginal inhabitants of a very vast area of Central Australia.
Mary Loughran, field linguist, has been living with the Warlpiri for over a decade.
The Warlpiri language is a very interesting language. Like other Central Australian languages, it has probably been spoken in relative isolation from non-Australian languages, possibly up to 60,000 years. So it makes it very interesting for research for linguists who are interested in finding out about differences between languages, but probably more particularly interested in finding about what is common to human language.
The Warlpiri people were nomads until a short time ago. Now they cluster in the town of Yuendamu, where they have adopted many European ways. As nomads, they value things they can carry in their heads instead of on their backs, like language. Stories which can be told in paintings or in words. Here, the subtle use of language is highly prized. Jacamara's painting is the story of a whirlwind, a legend going back to prehistory in the time they call the dreaming. There is an unusual sign language version of Warlpiri for use in special situations.
No, nobody speaks a primitive language. All languages are extremely sophisticated. All human language constitutes a very, very sophisticated system.
Warlpiri turns out to be an inflected word-ending language, like Greek or Latin.
That was one word which I just typed into the dictionary there. Warlpiri is typically a language that has very, very long words made up of many, many meaningful parts. Unlike English, Warlpiri doesn't rely on the order in which words come in a sentence to convey the sort of meaning that order conveys in English. What Warlpiri uses instead are little suffixes which go onto a given word and which indicates the role of that word. So, for example, to say the boy kicked the ball in Warlpiri, we would say something like Wirialo, Pakano, Japu Japu. Japu Japu is the word for ball. Wiria is the word for boy. But to indicate that the boy is the doer of the action, we have an extra little piece on it, which is lu. So we say Wirialo. And then we have the verb Pakano, and then we have Japu Japu. In Warlpiri, the exactly same message would come across if I changed the order of the words, for example, and said Wirialo, Pakano, Japu Japu. Or Japu Japu, Pakano, Wirialo. Or I could say Pakano, Wirialo, Japu Japu. However, it doesn't matter what order the words are in, exactly the same message will come across that I am saying the boy kicked the ball.
So the Warlpiri, it's an Aboriginal people. It's a very old language spoken by a people that group of people that didn't have a lot of contact with other groups. It's a amazingly complex language. It's a language that's heavily inflected. So the example of very long words that are constructed by just adding suffix after suffix. Word order doesn't matter at all, so it's very different than a language like English or German, Spanish for that matter, but it's certainly not a primitive language. One of the sad things about the world languages is how many languages are endangered and how many die away. And we're going to watch a short clip about that and then talk about that issue.
Manye muwan mangarji era uninga kakudu Ardawuj. What Ardawuj?
Could you say that again?
Ardawuj.
And the sun?
Muwan, the sun.
There are over 7,000 languages spoken in the world. And unfortunately, at least half of those languages are in danger of extinction. Scientists estimate that a human language disappears about every 2 weeks. And in Australia, there are at least 100 languages that are hanging on the very brink of extinction. You might wonder why we should care if an obscure Australian language that only has 3 speakers goes extinct. Why does that affect us? The knowledge that those people possess is unique. They've been here long before humans populated Europe. They have intricate knowledge of plants and animals that may not even be known to science at all. Most of this knowledge has never been written down anywhere. You can't find it in a book or an encyclopedia or a database. It's only in people's heads. If that knowledge evaporates, then we've all lost something. We're all impoverished by the death of a single language. As a linguist and as a scientist, I feel a real sense of urgency. People travel around the world to see things that they think are ancient. The ancient in Australia is not in the seeing, it's not buildings or monuments, it's in the hearing. To hear the wisdom from the mouths of the last speakers of these nearly extinct languages. The transmission of knowledge has been disrupted.
What do we lose when we lose languages? Well, we lose a lot of knowledge that's bound up with that language and that culture. There are traditions and stories that are not written down. Typically, as we know, only about 10% of the world languages have written forms. And we lose the knowledge that is handed down from generations to generations of native plants and herbs, for example. Why are languages going away? Well, it's partly the impact of globalization. Their trade is reaching everywhere. Media is becoming globalized. English is very widespread now. And so there are fewer and fewer kind of isolated parts of the world. The modern media reaches almost all groups. But at the same time, technology is not just something that endangers languages. This can help as well. I've put a sound file from a recent NPR story in the media folder for Chapter 7 on Blackboard that talks about that issue. There is some interesting cases of languages that were threatened but were revived. Hebrew is probably the best known, which is spoken in Israel, but for a long time was not really a spoken language except in temple and synagogues. But now is the official language of Hebrew, and it's a colloquial spoken language. You have the example also of Celtic languages that are close to extinction but are being revived. Hawaiian is a successfully revived language. And you have the interesting case of Esperanto. It's not a revived language, it's a created language, an artificial language, but one that over the years has garnered a lot of interest. The last thing we're going to talk about in this chapter are versions of language. We've mentioned the word dialect. Well, what's a dialect? And one definition is a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Well, that to a certain extent is true, namely that a language is often defined by national borders. But basically a dialect is a distinctive version of a language, and it's distinctive not only by its vocabulary and pronunciation, but also typically by its grammar, by its structure. In that way it differs from an accent, which is really just pronunciation. Jargon is also very limited. It just refers to a different set of vocabulary. There are two terms here that are often confused, pidgin and Creole. Well, what's a pidgin? A pidgin is a simplified language with very little structure that develops so that two groups can trade with one another, basically, who represent different languages. And so it's a very simplified structure, very little structure. It's mostly just vocabulary related to commerce that's needed for that purpose. Well, what's a Creole? A Creole is actually a language that originates from a pidgin but develops into a full-fledged language. And it's a mixture of languages. So, for example, you have Haitian Creole, which is a mixture of French, a little bit of English thrown in, but also a large dose of African languages. You have various Creoles based on English, based on Spanish, based on French. Code switching is moving between languages. It's something that we refer to that bilinguals do, multilinguals. and the case of, for example, Hispanics in the United States switching from Spanish to English, even within the same sentence. Lingua franca refers to a common language used by speakers of different languages. So in the ancient times, that was Latin. In the 17th, 18th centuries in Europe, it was French. Today, it's pretty much English, the lingua franca. So with that, we've reached the end of this presentation, and in the last presentation for Chapter 7, we're going to be talking about communication styles and language learning.